The smell came first. Thick, acrid and alive, the smell of burning oil clinging to human skin. Rome called it purification, the crowd called it justice, but to Lucia, it was the scent of her own ending. The morning air was damp when they dragged her to the forum. Not for trial, or that was long over, but for performance. The city loved its punishments like theatre, and Lucia's sin had earned her a starring role. Her husband had accused her of adulterium, and in Rome a woman's body was not her own to defend. It was a vessel of virtue for her husband, her family, her gods. To stain it, even with whispered desire, was to wound the moral skin of the empire itself. They stripped her of her garments before the jeering crowd. Her pale body trembled beneath the judgment of hundreds, her knees pressing into the cold marble as the lictors brought out the tunica molesta, the annoying tunic, they called it, though there was nothing trivial about its design. A coarse linen robe soaked in oil, pitch and resin, it glistened black in the sunlight, heavy with the smell of death, even before the flames touched it. When they forced it over her shoulders, it clung to her like a living thing. Lucia gasped, feeling the slick fabric slide across her skin. The smell of burning oil would stay with her until the last breath. But this was not only a punishment, it was a lesson, a warning to every woman watching. Sin could not hide in the folds of beauty. As they tied the cords around her waist, the priest began the invocation, a prayer for cleansing, for divine fire to purge the unworthy. May her body burn that her soul may be saved. The words echoed across the forum, swallowed by the crowd's hunger. Some wept, some laughed, but most just stared, because cruelty, when done in the name of law, becomes easy to look at. Lucia tried to speak, to plead perhaps or confess, but her voice was drowned beneath the chanting. Someone struck a torch. Another man stepped forward, solemn as a priest at a funeral, and touched the flame to the hem of her tunic. The fire didn't roar, it crawled, slow, deliberate, cruelly patient. The oil-fed cloth began to bubble and hiss, clinging tighter as the heat rose. The smell of burning pitch mixed with flesh, that thick, inescapable scent, wrapping the forum in invisible smoke. Rome's citizens stood silent now, even the cruel ones had stopped cheering. Watching a woman's body become its own pyre was not entertainment, it was revelation. This was what Rome called order. The tunica molesta was not made to kill quickly. That was the point. The linen acted like a second skin, trapping the heat and sealing it in. The victim's screams would stretch into song, a hymn of agony to the gods of discipline. In the Republic's early days, it had been reserved for arsonists and traitors, but as the empire grew paranoid and morality became weaponized, the tunic found new flesh, that of women accused of moral impurity. Lucia's name would be forgotten, but her smell, that lingering oil fire scent, would mark the space for days. Vendors complained of it. The marble floor beneath her feet was blackened, a scar the rain could not wash away. And yet the next morning Rome carried on. The senators debated, the merchants traded, the poets recited their odes. The empire was too grand to pause for one burning woman, but beneath the grandeur, something darker pulsed, a quiet consensus that cruelty was necessary, even holy. That was the paradox of Rome, civilization built on spectacle, virtue enforced through horror. And here in the tunica molesta, the two met perfectly. A punishment wrapped in ceremony, designed not just to destroy the body, but to remind everyone watching who owned it. The women who saw Lucia burn that day carried the smell home with them. They scrubbed their skin raw in the baths, fearing even a trace of oil. They learned not to laugh too loudly, not to walk alone, not to linger near forbidden eyes. Because in Rome, sin was not what you did, it was what others could accuse you of. The priests would later claim the ritual had spiritual value. They called it purgatio per ignem, purification through fire. They said the flames washed away deceit and desire, returning the soul to its rightful place. But behind those pious words lay a simpler truth. It was control. Fire was not chosen because it was divine. Fire was chosen because it left nothing untouched. And Rome needed that, the spectacle of absolute surrender. Even now, centuries later, Historians debate whether the tunica molesta was punishment or ritual. Some argue it was symbolic, a warning more than an act. But the records are clear. Women were burned alive, often for the simplest of crimes. The poet Ovid hinted at it in exile, writing that the same hands that burn incense to Venus burn women for invoking her. Lucia was not the first, and she would not be the last. That's the hidden cruelty of empire. It refines its punishments into philosophy. The tunica molesta became a metaphor, a moral tool to keep the populace obedient. Every time the flames rose, Rome reminded itself that virtue could be enforced through terror. And the smell meant that lingering, suffocating scent became a kind of invisible scripture floating through the alleys and temples, whispering obedience into every nostril. This is the story the monuments don't tell. Rome's marble facades gleam with triumphs and victories, but in the cracks between them, you can still find soot, the residue of the forgotten. And if you listen closely, in the silence between the tourists' footsteps, you might still catch that faint scent of burning oil. Because cruelty once sanctified never really disappears. It evolves. It hides behind new names, new rituals, new laws. And that is why we tell these stories. To exhume the bones buried beneath marble. To remind ourselves that every empire, no matter how glorious, carries its own ghosts. This is the Crimson Archive, where we unearth the punishments history tried to forget. If you believe cruelty must be remembered, not romanticized, stay with us. Subscribe, share, and help keep these truths burning. Not as torches of fear, but of awareness. Because somewhere, beneath the ashes of empire, Lucia is still burning, waiting for someone to finally smell the truth. The tunica molesta. Rome called it a robe, but it was a weapon, a slow execution stitched into linen and soaked in fear. To understand it, you must understand how Rome engineered obedience. Every empire needs a spectacle, something to make its citizens watch and tremble. The tunic of fire did more than punish, it taught. At its core, it was brutally simple. A sleeveless garment, rough to the touch, made from linen or hemp. The cloth was first drenched in oil, pitch, and occasionally sulfur. The mixture gave it that thick, choking smell, the same scent that clung to every forum after a burning. To Romans, it was the smell of justice. To those chosen to wear it, it was the scent of damnation already begun. When heated, the pitch sealed against the skin. Every movement, even a breath, tightened the burning fabric. Victims didn't die from the flames alone. They suffocated beneath their own melting skin. The oil trapped the fire like a lover's embrace. The crowd watched as the tunic merged with flesh, until body and punishment became one indistinguishable mass of agony. And yet, the tunica molesta was not born from barbarism. It came from bureaucracy. In the Roman mind, cruelty had to be justified by order. Public punishments were a civic duty. To kill privately was crime. To kill publicly was justice. The law known as Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coascendis gave men, husbands, fathers, magistrates, power over women's morality. It was a system that didn't need soldiers, only spectators. And the crowd, in their silence, became the machinery of control. Each burning served as a mirror, showing citizens what awaited disobedience. And the women learned quickly. Their bodies became extensions of the state, their virtue a form of taxation. Rome's punishments were never random. They were theater, built to mold the mind. The tunica molesta had its origins in older executions for arsonists. In the Republic, those who set fire to sacred buildings were forced to wear it. Poetic justice, fire consuming the firemaker. But as centuries passed, the fire turned inward. Rome began to fear internal corruption more than external invasion. And so the robe once meant for traitors now found its way to women, mothers, lovers, thinkers, any who threatened the illusion of purity. In temples, priests spoke of divine flames. In courts, jurists spoke of moral decay. But beneath both, you could smell it. The oil, the pitch, that same scent that had no name except control. And the punishment's power wasn't only in the burning itself, it was in the waiting. Many victims were forced to wear the tunic long before it was lit. hours, sometimes days, kneeling in the square as flies gathered. The pitch stuck to their skin like a second breathing creature. They could feel the heat of the torches nearby, smell the anticipation. Imagine that moment, bound hands, bare feet pressing into cold marble, the cloth already tightening with sweat. You could hear the city moving around you, merchants haggling, priests chanting, soldiers laughing. Life continued. And yet, you were the center of its rhythm, the sacrifice to make everything else feel stable. That's the psychology of empire, stability built on spectacle. Rome didn't need to convince its citizens of right or wrong. It only needed them to watch. Each burning became a sermon, each scream a syllable in the language of fear. There are records of these rituals in fragments, letters, satire, moral treatises. Seneca wrote that, "To punish in view of all is to preserve the virtue of all." He meant it as philosophy. But behind those words was the real doctrine of control, fear as spectacle. Even the architects understood. The forum's design allowed flames to rise unobstructed, wind channeled by marble walls, smoke lifting like incense. The audience stood above the condemned, looking down, always looking down. That was intentional. Rome's architecture reinforced hierarchy. The women burned in the forum were always below. The tunica molesta became part of religious vocabulary, a fire baptism for the fallen. Priests spoke of ignis purgans, purging flame. They claimed the gods demanded visibility, that sin must burn where the people could see. Yet in truth, it was men who demanded it. The gods were silent, the crowd was not, and it worked. For centuries, the ritual outlived its own logic. Even as emperors changed and philosophies shifted, the tunica remained, an instrument of patriarchal law disguised as moral hygiene. Roman playwrights hinted at it through allegory. In Seneca's tragedies, you can almost hear echoes of it. Women who defy, who desire, who are consumed by fire as both punishment and purification. History blurred into art, art into justification. The smell of oil and burning linen seeped into culture. It became metaphor, superstition, warning. Mothers told their daughters, "Be still, be quiet, or the tunic will find you." Even in Roman bathhouses, where women gathered to gossip and cleanse, the smell lingered in memory. Some said it clung to the marble, that no matter how much perfume or incense filled the air, that scent, faint and stubborn, always remained. But beneath the horror, there was precision. Rome's punishments were always engineered to be remembered. A quick death fades from collective mind, a slow one carves itself into history. And that's what the tunica molesta achieved, a memory so strong it survived millennia, carried by the invisible sensory ghost of burning oil. When historians describe Rome's moral reforms, they often speak of legislation, not the flames beneath it. But here's the truth. Morality, when enforced through terror, becomes performance, and performance needs audience. The crowd's faces, reflected in the firelight, reveal the deeper motive, fascination disguised as virtue. They didn't come to mourn, they came to witness. Every empire builds its myths on such witnessings. Rome was no different. The tunic of fire was not just a device, it was an ideology in cloth, a woven sermon about obedience. It made sure that even those untouched by its flames felt its heat. And perhaps that's why the smell of burning oil stayed in Roman memory for generations, because it wasn't just the scent of death, it was the scent of control seared into the air of the world's greatest empire. And control, once refined, never burns away. It only changes form. The priests called it justice, the senators called it law, the poets called it tragedy. But for the women who wore it, it was something else entirely. A living tomb, a second skin that whispered, "Rome owns you." The tunica molesta was not an accident of cruelty, it was deliberate, systematic, sanctified. And the deeper horror, the one Rome never confessed, is that many who watched it happen believed it was merciful. Because when cruelty becomes familiar, it begins to look like order. And that's how empires survive, until the fire turns back on them. The day after Lucia burned, Rome celebrated a festival. The same square that had been her pyre was washed, perfumed, and repurposed for dance. Children played where her ashes had fallen. The city did not mourn, it disinfected. That's the quietest cruelty of empire, how efficiently it forgets. But the Tunica molesta didn't vanish with her screams. It left its mark not in statues or scrolls, but in behavior, in the trembling silence that passed between women when certain names were mentioned. The fire became folklore, a lesson taught without words. And yet, beneath that silence, something began to stir. You can trace it in whispers, in graffiti on temple walls, in poems copied in secret, in fragments of correspondence between wives of senators. One fragment reads, "I smelled her before I saw her. Oil, smoke, the perfume of virtue enforced. Tell me, what God asks for that?" The empire had created its own moral shadow, a fear so constant it began to breed quiet defiance. But history doesn't record rebellion as softly as it begins. It records it only when it bleeds. Decades after Lucia, during the reign of Domitian, the Tunica molesta returned to prominence. A noblewoman, unnamed in the official texts, was accused of heresy and lechery. But rumors say she had criticized the emperor's divinity in private letters. In Rome, a woman's tongue was more dangerous than her body. She was brought to the same square wearing the same blackened linen. The same smell filled the air, that thick, oily perfume of obedience. But this time something unexpected happened. The crowd didn't cheer. They stood uncertain, murmuring. Some said the fire refused to catch. Others claimed the torches burned low, their flames sputtering in defiance. The executioners grew nervous, circling her like wolves around a wounded god. The noblewoman looked up and laughed. It wasn't hysteria. It was something purer. They say her last words were, "If this is Rome's virtue, then may all your tunics catch fire together." And then she bit her own tongue, tearing it in two, choking herself before the flames could finish her. The priests called it an omen. The crowd dispersed in silence, but the smell remained thicker than ever. From that moment, the Tunica molesta's legend changed. It was no longer just a punishment. It became a curse. Soldiers whispered that those who lit the torches died of fever within weeks, that the smoke carried spirits of the burned, hovering over the forum like invisible sentinels. Rome began to turn uneasy with its own justice, because every spectacle, once repeated too long, begins to lose its magic and reveal its cruelty. The tunic had been created to terrify women into silence, but now it terrified Rome itself. The smell that once symbolized purity now signified guilt. Citizens began to cover their faces when the torches were brought out. Mothers pulled their children away from the square. Perfume merchants started blending heavy floral oils, roses, violets, myrrh, to mask that unholy scent. But nothing could erase it completely. That smell of burning oil, it had become Rome's invisible anthem, a scent of power trying to hide decay. And so, quietly, the state began to retreat from spectacle. Public burnings dwindled. The Tunica molesta slipped into history's margins, replaced by subtler forms of control, exile, shaming, religious branding. Rome didn't become kinder. It became cleverer. Still, the memory of the burning women haunted the city's art. Painters carved them into mosaics as unnamed martyrs. Philosophers reinterpreted their agony as allegory. "Through fire," wrote one Stoic scholar, "we purify the ungovernable passions." But that's how history hides its guilt, by turning cruelty into philosophy. And yet fragments of resistance remained. Archaeologists have found scratched markings on the underside of marble seats near the forum. The letters, though faint, read, "She burned for loving. We watch and learn." It's small, almost invisible, but it speaks. Even as Rome perfected its systems of control, the cracks began to form. By the 3rd century, as Christianity spread, the narrative reversed. Fire, once Rome's weapon, became the symbol of its own coming doom. Christian writers called the Tunica molesta the garment of demons. They claimed those who had burned women in it would themselves burn eternally. But here lies the deepest irony. When Rome fell, the flame did not die. It migrated. The idea of fire as purification, of burning the sinful woman to preserve virtue, outlived the empire itself. Medieval Europe borrowed it, refined it, renamed it. The witch's pyre, the heretic stake, the chastity of flame. Each age reinvented the tunica molesta, not in form, but in purpose. Always the same logic: destroy the body to cleanse the idea. And always, that smell of burning oil returned. In every square, every village, every sermon about purity. Rome may have forgotten Lucia's name, but it taught the world her death. That's the shock history never admits. Cruelty doesn't vanish, it evolves. The fire that started in the Forum traveled through centuries, consuming women in every civilization that pretended to save them. And somewhere, behind every holy justification, every law written in the language of morality, you can still catch it, faint but undeniable. That same smell of oil and pitch. It's there in the pages of the Inquisition. It's there in the rhetoric of purity movements. It's there in the modern hunger to judge, to cleanse, to destroy the disobedient in the name of order. Rome's tunic may have rotted into dust, but the ideology it wrapped around the human body, that survived. The punishment's genius wasn't the fire. It was the illusion that it saved. And that illusion, that fire could purify, that pain could make one holy, would become the backbone of centuries of moral violence. Every time humanity looked at a woman and saw danger instead of dignity, Rome's shadow flickered nearby. Every time someone said she deserved it, the old smoke rose again, and every time the world looked away, the fire learned how to burn slower, quieter, smarter. That's the legacy of the tunica molesta. It taught us how to hide cruelty behind the scent of sanctity. And though centuries have passed, though the flames have cooled, though the marble has turned to ruin, that smell of burning oil still drifts through history's corridors. It clings to every empire that claims to act in the name of virtue. Because once a civilization learns to burn its own in public, it never truly unlearns the warmth. And if you listen, even now, in the echo of sermons, in the crackle of televised outrage, in the scent of scorched ambition, you can hear it. Rome's fire still whispering, waiting to be called justice again. Centuries later, the Forum stands in ruins. Broken columns jut from the earth like ribs, and tourists drift through with cameras and bottled water, smiling under the Roman sun. They see the stones, not the smoke. They photograph the marble, not the memory. But if you stand there long enough, if you breathe deep, the air still holds something faint. That same smell: oil, dust, heat. It lingers like the ghost of the tunica molesta, clinging to history's throat. The guides never mention it. They speak of emperors and victories, of Caesar's ashes and Augustus's triumphs. But the square where women once burned is described only as a ceremonial site. A phrase clean enough to forget what the ceremony was. This is how cruelty hides, not by vanishing but by being renamed. Rome fell, yes, but the logic of its fire survived. It found new tongues, new rituals, new reasons. In the Middle Ages, inquisitors spoke Latin prayers as they lit their pyres. In the Renaissance, reformers justified flames with scripture. In the modern world, the pyres changed shape, reputations destroyed instead of bodies, the oil replaced with rumor, the smoke with silence. And yet, the scent remains. That smell of burning oil, it follows us like inheritance. Every time we punish instead of understand, every time we call humiliation a moral victory, the air thickens again. You see, the tunica molesta was never just a garment. It was an idea that purity is worth pain, that order needs witnesses, that a woman's suffering could sanctify a man's fear. Rome built it. The centuries wore it. Even now, the same psychology lives on, dressed in modern robes. We still build forums. They're digital now, endless, merciless. The crowds still gather, not with torches, but with words. A click, a post, a sentence, and someone burns. Slowly, publicly, righteously. The tunic's fabric has changed, but its function hasn't. And maybe that's the greatest horror, how civilized the fire has become. In Rome, Cruelty was loud. Now it's efficient. It hides behind algorithms, policies, clean hands. The same performance, less smoke, more spectators. Lucia's scream has become data, translated into metrics of outrage. The crowd still watches, still justifies. Every age believes it is better than the last, but every age finds new fuel. And what Rome called purification, we call consequence. What they called justice, we call progress. But beneath the vocabulary, the smell is the same. Burning oil, smoldering fabric, the hiss of something human being stripped away. Look closely at the ruins, not with your eyes but with your conscience. The stones remember more than victories. They remember complicity, the citizens who watched, the priests who blessed, the poets who wrote that the fire was mercy. And somewhere, beneath those layers of marble and myth, lies the simplest truth. Empire is not destroyed by enemies. It rots from the cruelty it excuses. Lucia never knew that her death would become metaphor, that her body, devoured in slow light, would feed centuries of moral imagination. But perhaps that's the truest punishment of all, to be remembered not as a person, but as a lesson. The tunica molesta was meant to erase her. Instead, it preserved her, not in bone or ash, but in the architecture of fear itself. And that architecture still stands. Every system that punishes women for disobedience, every society that uses shame as control, every institution that confuses silence with virtue, they are Rome, rebuilding itself in new shapes. History is not a line, it's a circle of smoke. We keep returning to the fire, believing it's light. So when you hear someone speak of purity, when you hear words like necessary correction or moral cleansing, listen closely. There's something beneath the language, a whisper from the forum, a hiss of linen catching flame. That's the sound of the tunica molesta still breathing through time, and the smell, always the smell, rising again to remind us that what we sanctify, we repeat. Rome's cruelty did not end in ashes. It evolved into habits, institutions, and rituals that still burn, invisibly, acceptably, endlessly. Lucia's scream may be gone, but her silence lives on, woven into the fabric of every age that forgets her. And that is why remembrance matters, not to relive the horror, but to recognize its reflection in the mirror. Every empire claims it will be different. Every generation believes it has outgrown the barbarism of its past. But civilization is not measured by its monuments. It's measured by what it chooses to look away from. The tunic of fire teaches us that progress without empathy is just refinement of cruelty. That spectacle dressed as virtue is still violence. And that silence, polite, reasonable silence, is the oxygen every fire needs. So the question remains, what do we still burn today? And who do we call it justice for? The forum's stones can't answer. They've seen too much, but we can. That's why this story exists, not as punishment, but as mirror. Because to remember Lucia is to challenge every empire that claims righteousness through suffering, to smell the oil in the air and refuse to call it perfume. And as long as we tell her story, as long as the flame is named for what it was, she will never truly burn again. This is the Crimson Archive. We exhume what empires buried, the bones, the ash, the smell of truth itself. If this story unsettled you, it should. Let it. Share it. Subscribe to keep the fire of memory alive, not to consume, but to illuminate. Because when we stop smelling the smoke, that's when history begins to burn us all over again.